Dating in the military can be tough, especially in the sea service branches. Hard to meet someone and keep the relationship going when you spend all your time out on the open water. I actually did meet my wife during a port call. That's what they taught us, right? Improvise, adapt, and overcome. But suppose a military man did meet a girl in a foreign city aimed at SPKS. What would make their first date that memorable? Let's say it starts with a romantic walk along the beach to watch the sunset, and then an evening stroll through a quaint little village nearby, so quaint the inhabitants still light their streets and homes with oil lamps. And then, what if as they both lay down on the grass to stare up at the stars, everything suddenly went dark, they both fell asleep, blacked out really, and when they woke up the village they had just walked through was now gone. That certainly seems like a night that neither of them would soon forget. Bizarre as it may seem, this is exactly what happened to a young Coast Guardsman named John and his companion, a young nursing student named Barbara, both of whom verified this story despite having never known each other when they first met in Bermuda while John was on shore leave. What happened to them that night would become what some have called one of the most convincing accounts of time travel ever recorded. This is the baffling and somewhat heartbreaking story of a Coast Guardsman in music. Bermuda, the mist which hangs before you offers you a choice to pass through or to escape beyond it, are stories which defy explanation and fly in the face of what we know to be real. It is a void of both reality and impossibility, of both fact and superstition. You alone are left to discern what to believe as you pass through what we call the fog. Yeah, the story in this episode interestingly touches on many of the various difficulties that we might face in life. Over the weekend, I had the chance to speak with a family member of a Marine that we lost several years ago. It was his mom. We talked for about 3 hours catching up, and since I'm going to go visit their family soon, she invited me to skip the hotel and stay at the house in his old room, which he told me that she hasn't touched since the day he died. She's just kept it clean and tidy. Losing someone is never easy, whether through death or when our relationships suddenly end, and coming back from a place of grief can take us years. It's taken us years, but during that time we all sought therapy, which greatly helped. And in light of this, I want to quickly say thank you. To better you get used to the isolation, I guess that must get lonely sometimes. I don't mind it, kind of peaceful actually. But yeah, I can get a little quiet out there. That's why I don't mind coming to places like this. Good change of scenery. I get that nursing schools, well, it's a grind. You know, you've got your hands full with those books. It was Thanksgiving Day 1964 as the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, and a little-known country called Vietnam began to dominate newspaper headlines. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Half Moon sailed its way into waters off the island of Bermuda for the young Coast Guardsmen aboard, including John Murphy. The tiny island, situated in the western Atlantic, was a paradise like their own little slice of Hawaii, half a world away. While the Half Moon was there on an official training mission, the day's Thanksgiving festivities were in full swing for the vessel. The crew enjoyed being treated to a hearty meal before then getting to spend some free time off ship in the nearby port. For John and his 3 buddies, there wasn't a moment to waste. As soon as the ship was docked and their dinner plates were scraped clean, they headed straight down to the pier, excited to start enjoying their next few days of shore leave. Of course, it didn't take the Coast Guardsmen long to find the nearest bar, and it was there that John's life would take both an exciting and yet rather unbelievable turn. Seated nearby at another table, a group of 4 young women student nurses with the U.S. Navy caught the attention of John and his 3 friends. After a couple drinks provided them some much-needed courage, the men decided it was time to make introductions. John felt a bit sheepish. He hesitated before leaving the table. He had a fiancée back home, and then maybe it was the alcohol, but he just couldn't help himself. One of the women at the table gave him an odd feeling, as if he recognized her from somewhere. He felt inexplicably drawn to her, and it didn't help that she seemed to be just as interested in him. So JN made his way over, feeling a bit flushed. Of course, he was just going to talk to her, but boy was she a knockout. John soon discovered her name was Barbara. She was 19. John kept laughing in spite of himself. He couldn't believe she was talking to him. She was one of the prettiest girls he'd ever seen. After a few more laughs and cheerful conversation, Over drinks, the men invited the women back to the Half Moon, offering to give them a private tour of the ship. When their tour had finished, the 4 Coast Guardsmen, each of them now locked arm in arm with one of the young women, made their way back out into town, eager to keep the night going with more drinks and some dancing. John and Barbara, however, had other plans. They quietly broke away from the group, deciding they would much rather enjoy one another's company alone. They walked towards the nearby Fort St. Catherine, a fortress with its origins stretching back to the earliest days of British settlement in 162. As they walked and talked, John felt a little more at ease. It turned out that Barbara was also engaged to be married, so they kept things light, their conversation feeling both fun and effortless. But as their time alone wore on, John began to realize it was much more than flirty banter and charisma. For some strange reason, this all just felt too familiar. It was an odd sensation, as if they had known each other for many years. As he looked at Barbara, her arm tucked in his, her carefree laugh and wonderful smile, Jan suddenly realized this wasn't merely a boyish attraction. He may be young, but he knew this feeling. It was love, music. Oh, what a beautiful view. Nothing like this back in North Carolina. Oh, no, and not as such. Barbara, this is going to sound crazy, and maybe it is, but what is it? John, does this feel familiar to you? I don't know how to explain it, but talking to you just feels— I know what you mean, and you do. Talking to you just feels right. It's like I've been away for a long time, but the second I saw you, I was back home. Listen, why don't we just keep walking? I need to stretch my legs. Come on. So we're sitting on top of this low wall looking out at the battlements. Fort St. Catherine, you got the ocean, and there's the sun just dipping below the horizon. It was very beautiful, and I finally told Barbara what I was feeling, which was this sense that I already knew her, and I was hoping she wasn't just going to think it was some kind of pickup line. It was truly a feeling I could not explain fully, but to my surprise, Barbara not only seemed to understand, but she said that she had been feeling much the same. They stared at each other, the sun now slipping out of sight as the sky turned a brilliant pink. Then they came to their senses. Both were engaged, and an affair was the last thing either of them wanted. Smiling sheepishly, Jan and Barbara left their place on the low wall, but decided to at least continue their walk. Without really thinking about it, their feet seemed to draw them both down a small trail leading away from the fort and towards a hill. As they neared the crest of this hill, John was struck by another odd sense of familiarity. Like déjà vu, he had never been to Bermuda before, but now even the landscape around him suddenly felt very familiar. He then had a strange thought. Knowing she wouldn't make fun of him for sharing it, he turned to Barbara. Before reaching the top, he said that even though he had never been here, he knew what was waiting for them on the other side of the hill. He couldn't explain it, but he just knew they were about to see an old colonial village with a tall church tower seemingly abused as he was. Barbara said yes, that's exactly what she was thinking, further adding that the church steeple had a broken clock showing a time of 12:30. Then it felt as if the world around them had in a moment become unnaturally calm and silent. Even the constant crashing of the waves now seemed to be muted. Finally reaching the top of the rise, the couple looked down over the other side and stopped. Even in the tropical humidity, they felt the chill run down their backs. Before them was a small 18th century colonial settlement. It was almost exactly as Barbara and John had predicted. Permanent amongst the small houses and buildings was a church, its tower looming over the humble town square. On its steeple a clock displayed the time of 12:30. The hands appeared to be unmoving. It was broken. While baffling, the scene felt overwhelmingly familiar to both of them, so taking one another's hand, they descended the hill and entered the village. The old town was like something out of another time. Not only the buildings themselves, but John and Barbara couldn't help noticing that the streets were still lit by oil lamps. Peering in through windows, they saw lanterns burning within the many homes and buildings. What was more, the village was eerily desolate. John and Barbara saw no one else as they wandered the streets, seemingly all alone. Crossing the village square, the two made for the church, pulling on the solid wooden doors, only to find that the building was locked. Looking around, feeling drawn to it, they then strolled over to the nearby cemetery. Across the center of it, they noticed a low stone wall had been built. evidently to divide one half from the other again. Despite this being their first time seeing it, the two instinctively knew something they couldn't explain. This wall was meant to segregate the headstones of white and black burial plots. Barbara wanted to rest for a moment. John agreed, unable to explain the feeling. Finding a spot to sit atop the wall that bordered the exterior of the cemetery, something even more extraordinary than happened. Barbara and John were flooded with strange memories, but this time it wasn't about old churches, broken clocks, and cemetery walls. It was as if they were catching glimpses of a life they'd once shared together, as if they had once lived on the island as a married couple raising a family, though neither John nor Barbara could begin to understand how. After sharing these memories as they occurred one after another, the two of them reached an identical and awful conclusion. They had an overwhelming sense that they had also died together in this past life. An ominous feeling they had both met a tragic end. Still, they were perfectly fine now. They smiled. It was an odd thing meeting each other in a bar, touring his ship, and then walking into a strange village and recounting identical memories from a life they had never lived. It was only a shame they hadn't met each other sooner. Barbara looked up at the night sky, hopping down off the wall. She dug into her bag, pulling out a blanket she'd used earlier during a trip to the beach. Laying it out on the soft grass of the cemetery, she and John lay down, staring up at the stars. The air was chilly. They held each other a little more closely, trying desperately to keep their thoughts on the fact that they were both engaged to someone else. This is really nice. Yeah, sure, Pat's ditch and rescue drills, that's for sure. John, yeah. Barbara, I want you to kiss me just once. Oh, okay, yeah. And that's when it happened. I closed my eyes and leaned forward to kiss her, but before our lips came together, everything around us grew dark, and it felt as if we were tumbling together into a bottomless abyss. Music. The sensation of falling finally ended, and then without any warning both of us passed music out. John said that he and Barbara woke up a few hours later feeling groggy and very confused about what had just happened. As it was now in the early morning hours, they left the village in a hurry, making for the town of St. George, to the hotel where Barbara and her friends were staying. Before she went inside, Barbara stopped and looked at John. What could she say? He forced a smile. Their goodbye was awkward. They exchanged addresses, promising to stay in touch the next morning. Barbara would catch her flight back to the USJ and would stay in Bermuda for another 10 days. After a brief hug, she turned, and John watched her walk away. Earlier in the evening it had felt like he had lost her once before, although he couldn't understand why. John felt like he was losing her all over. Music. Again, making his way back to the ship, John fell into a restless sleep in his bunk. That same night he had a very vivid dream. He was back in the village. When he woke the next morning, he knew the dream meant something. His meeting with Barbara, none of it made any sense, but he had to find out why. He decided he would try to find out as much as he could about the strange village before his time in Bermuda ended. It was another 2 days before he was granted shore leave again. His first stop would be the village. On one hand, he wanted to see if he would experience the same sense of eerie familiarity that he had felt with Barbara. At the same time, he wanted to recreate the sense of being with her, to relive that uncanny feeling that they had shared together about having once lived there as a husband and wife. However, as he once again crested the top of the same small hill which hid the town from view, he stopped dead. John looked around, feeling as if the bottom had dropped out of his stomach. The village was gone. All that he could see was open pasture land, not a single building in sight. I fully expected it to be there. In addition to wanting to see it in the daytime, I was going to find a place to sit and write a letter to Barbara. I was totally surprised and found it hard to believe when I wasn't there. I don't know if it's important, but thought you might want to know that we were able to touch and feel the houses and the church, and both of us sat on the graveyard wall. These were solid objects. Also, when we tried to enter the church, the doors wouldn't open, but they definitely made noise when I pulled and pushed on the door handle, so there were definitely sounds. Understandably shaken, John quickly made his way back to St. George, stopping at a local pub. He needed a drink to settle his nerves, probably more than one. After a few sips, the Coast Guardsman struck up a conversation with the bartender, trying to sound casual as he asked the elderly man if he knew anything about an old village nearby. The man thought for a moment. While he wasn't aware of any current villages or towns in the direction John had pointed, he recalled once hearing about a hamlet that had once stood near the old fort. It had been built sometime in the 1700s, but was wiped out in the late 18th century by what he called the Great Hurricane. The massive storm was otherwise